Wait, so the balance team were about to buff Vladimir before Worlds? Hello everybody and welcome to another ProGuides video. My name is Dan, and today, instead of talking about the current solo queue meta, we'll be discussing Riot's recent dev blog on balancing the game around pro play. So how exactly does Riot change the game in a way that it can be healthy at both the highest and lowest levels of gameplay? What would happen in Iron if Riot buffed an easy intro-level champ like Amumu to be viable at the pro level? Well, we'll be looking into that and more. But first, today's question of the day. What champs do you think will be the most popular in each role at Worlds this year? Be sure to let us know your answer in the comments below. And one last thing, be sure to visit us at ProGuides.com. We have the best roster of coaches, top-tier live classes from instructors like Mike Young and Zyrene, and courses covering a variety of roles and champs from your favorite pro players like Doublelift. We want to help you improve where you're lacking and polish up where you're already strong so you can reach your season goals. Now, let's get right into this video. When you stop and think about it, League of Legends balancing is pretty insanely complex. We just hit the 150th champ, and when you factor in all the runes, items, and team comps, there are an unlimited amount of interactions that can happen. No one can ever really figure out what the exact most ideal strats are, so we end up with a meta that is constantly evolving. This is why really OP strategies such as funneling, supports being played top lane, or the recently discovered Luxona bot lane pop up seemingly out of nowhere. So with every single buff and nerf made to the game, Riot has to try to predict how any given change may influence a champ, or in some cases, an entire archetype of champs. This becomes even more complicated when those balance changes are aimed directly at a very specific level of play. For example, if Riot overbuffs Lucian in an attempt to make him strong in pro play, he would immediately become a dominant force in solo queue, forcing pretty much all scaling hyper carries out of the meta. Starting in 2019, Riot wanted to give the player base some transparency in how they actually balance the game. This included some rules and thresholds when it comes to how they choose what champs to buff or nerf. To follow up on that, they released more insight into champion balance in dev blogs in June and July, and just recently, a new post has seen them shedding light on how they walk the tightrope of balancing the game for pro play without ruining it everywhere else. So to start things off, Riot talks about how they formulate their pro balancing in the regular season. For starters, they only use the top 4 regions, LCK, LPL, LEC, and LCS, to gather data from, despite there being 12 regional leagues around the world. The top 4 are picked based on their performance at international events in recent years. One important distinction that is made when it comes to champ balance in pro play is that Riot has to use a different metric for determining when it's time to buff or nerf a champ due to the sample size of games available. On any given patch, there are hundreds of thousands of games played in solo queue globally, but in pro play, there are about 200. So in solo queue, a champ's win rate is indicative of how strong it is, but in pro play, Riot has to go by their presence, which is a combination of their pick and ban rates. Sometimes a champ may have a 50% win rate, but if they're being picked and banned in 100% of games, it's a pretty good indicator that they are powerful enough to influence drafting for both teams to an extreme extent. The first indicator that a champ needs to be nerfed is if they are over 95% presence rate on a patch. The second is if they're over 80% presence on more than one patch in a row. The first layer serves to catch the over-the-top S-tier meta picks, while the second exists to stop borderline OP champs from sitting near the top for too long. On the other side of the coin, champs that appear in less than 5% of games are considered underpowered and are deemed worthy of buffs. The overall goal of this balancing framework is to reach a more diverse champ pool. While in regular play, think normals and solo queue, pretty much every champ is played, the exact target for pro play is for 45% of all champions to be over a 5% presence rate. Riot previously released their champion balance framework, and one of the recommendations according to the tool is to only buff a champ when they're underpowered at all levels of play. This is why you don't see champs like Amumu getting buffs. He's pretty much unseen in higher levels of competition, but he excels in solo queue, especially at the average skill level. Anything pushing for him to be viable in pro would make him a monster in Iron and Bronze. Some champions are just better with certain audiences over others, and that's okay. This is why one of Riot's biggest challenges is specifically targeting pro play without negatively impacting the rest of us. In their own words, from Iron to the top professional league, we're all playing on the same rift. So with all that in mind, it gets even deeper when it comes to balancing for Worlds. Regular pro play sees a new patch every 2 weeks, but when it's time for Worlds, it's one patch for a 6-week period. When you account for the weeks of preparation leading up to it, this means there's a lot more time and effort being put into trying to solve the meta, with teams honing team comps and strategies, getting closer to the most optimal playstyle as time moves on. This also means that, in an ideal world, we as spectators get to see the meta evolve over the course of the tournament as new counter picks to champs and ideas to counter the most dominant strategies arise. In the past, there have been a few instances of a playstyle being too dominant at Worlds, such as 2017 when the Ardent Censor dominated the scene, resulting in the meta pretty much revolving around protect the ADC comps. The counters were few and far between, and most teams were relegated to falling in line with everyone else, and pretty much all gameplay was safe, scaling, and as a result, boring. To avoid one strategy becoming too prevalent in the world's stages, Riot has started minimizing the systemic balance changes, such as overhauling, buffing, or nerfing items and runes that can entirely shift the game in favor of one champ archetype or gameplay strategy in the patches leading up to Worlds. This means that there aren't many big shifts in balance once Summer Split has begun. In line with the stance of champ diversity, Riot specifically states that one major goal is no more 100% presence rate champs at Worlds. Draft strategy is just as important as in-game macro, and when a champ has a mandatory pick ban, it means that Red Team is pretty much forced to ban it out, and every single team has to know how to play it in case it gets through. In 2019 Worlds, they almost hit the mark, but Pantheon ended up reaching 100% pick ban. The learning point from this was that because players had pretty much no time to play him in pro games, he wasn't able to be balanced for Worlds. So a new policy was born. New champions and VGUs must be enabled for playoffs in all 4 of the top regions in order to be playable at the next international tournament. What does that mean for 2020? Lilia will be enabled for Worlds, but Yone sadly will not. As Worlds nears, the diversity ban tightens, with the presence rate requiring a nerf lowering to 90% on a single patch or 80% across 2 patches. This is to ensure optimal diversity, since the Worlds tournament takes place over such a long period of time. Part of increasing diversity is realizing that just because a champ is played doesn't mean it affects the meta. As a result, Riot has shifted their perspective from caring if a champ shows up at all to if a champ shows up in more than 5% of games. This lets them know whether something is a pocket pick or a one-time counter, rather than actually being competitively viable in a given meta. The target number is for 45% of all champs to have at least a 5% presence rate at Worlds, and with the current amount of champs in the game, that would mean seeing at least 67 different champs at Worlds at least a few different times. With all this in mind, Riot doesn't want to just mindlessly buff champs for the sake of seeing them on the world stage. In 2018, they made the mistake of buffing Kha'Zix's slow on his W, increasing his utility since it would be the most impactful in pro play. Not only did this make him too strong, but it did it in a way that was counterintuitive to his isolation-based assassin identity. Learning from this error, Riot gave Kha'Zix buffs earlier this year, but instead of giving him frustrating unilateral buffs across the board, they aimed at rewarding players who play to his identity, with an increase in damage against isolated targets. As an extra example, they cited the Kate buffs on 10.15. While pushing Kate up to viability in pro play can help diversify the meta, her performance has to be monitored, as even without being in the top tier of marksmen, she can be an incredibly frustrating champ to deal with thanks to her high range and lane dominance. Aside from establishing diversity across champs in general, one big focus is diversity in each position. If there were 15 champs played in jungle, mid, ADC, and support, but top was relegated to choosing between Ornn and Maokai every game, top lane would quickly become extremely stale. The goal for Worlds this year is to have at least 10 champs per position at 5% plus presence. This doesn't just mean 10 picks that fill the same job as the others. Riot wants to validate that best picks in each position have different power spikes and win conditions. To help accomplish this, the pro meta leading up to Worlds has been assessed, and individual buffs have been rolled out to champs, as opposed to systemic changes like we talked about earlier. For example, if Urgot was buffed to the point of being insanely OP, at the very worst he could become 100% pick or ban. If they went the systemic buff route instead, buff Black Cleaver and Death's Dance to help Urgot and 1 or 2 other struggling bruisers, untargeted champs would go from pretty good to really OP, with champs like Fiora and Jax becoming god tier, and bruisers as a whole taking over the meta, in the same way Ardent Censor pushed enchanters and hyper carries to being the definitive best core to a comp in Season 7. Specifically talking about the bot lane carry role, it has been one of the least diverse roles in the 2020 season. While the role itself may not be particularly weak, the pool has just been too shallow. Earlier in the season, Varus was nerfed in an attempt to open it up a bit, and as a result, champs like Aphelios, Ashe, Ezreal, and Kai'Sa have more wiggle room to scale their mid to late game power spikes. Instead of just buffing more hyper carries to throw into the pool, Riot looked to champs that played to early game strategies like Kalista and Varus already do, and landed on Caitlyn and Misfortune. They both play the same role of forcing pressure in lane, and have different power spikes than the champs that already existed in the meta before them. Now, looking at top lane, Riot saw that the champs had a good variety of power spikes, one of the two conditions for diversity. The listed examples were Renekton, Jace, and Volibear for early game, Kennen and Wukong for mid game, and Ornn, Camille, and Kayle for late game. So the variety of spikes is there, but there's one issue. All of these champs fall into one of two categories. Either win lane hard and brute force teamfights to win, or just lose early and scale to become a powerful late game front to back style of teamfighter. As a result, they ended up buffing Jax and Fiora to add some split pushers to the meta. Vlad was also considered for buffs, but was shelved for the time being for two reasons. For one, they didn't want scaling to late game to become a prevalent game plan across multiple roles. Second, he's a really strong pick in higher elos, and buffing him for the sake of pro play would probably make him a nightmare in solo queue, something we've already talked about Riot steering clear of. With all of that insight into balancing, bear in mind, the goal isn't to see every champion at every world. The goal is to see a pro meta that evolves year after year, with each year showing us new team comps and strategies. According to Riot, the highest level of games are about where they want them to be, and they expect to hit their target numbers for diversity this year at Worlds. Each year, Riot strives to balance the game based on champ power and diversity, and they're picking up new skills constantly to reach those goals. They're even tracking stats like average kills per game to let them know what champs make matches the most exciting. So next time you wonder why a champ is so broken or undertuned, remember that there is a lot more that goes into champion balance than most of us think about. And that is it for our recap on how Riot balances the game around pro play. Hopefully you got some insight into how things work behind the scenes. And remember, let us know which champs you think will be the most popular in each role in this year's Worlds. We love seeing what you all have to say. Can't wait to see you guys back for our next video. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you want to see more content just like this. And check out ProGuides.com if you want even more videos, tutorials, and even some private coaching from real pros. If you want to find me on social, you can at Daniel Ammerman. But for now, good luck out on the Rift, and please, wash those hands.